following program on Ada Derana 24 is classified for general audience. It is intended for all ages. It contains little or no violence, no strong language, and little or no sexual dialogue or situations.
Tonight, we discuss the updates on tax law in Sri Lanka. How have the recent reforms impacted the country's legal landscape? A very good evening and welcome to yet another episode of Law, Land and Liberty, where we bring to you key legal concepts and break it down for the layman. Now, today's topic is not new to any of us that have been previously tuned into the show, and that's on tax law. Specifically, the reason we picked up on tax law once again is due to the drastic changes that have occurred over the past few months following the new government that has come into place as well, and the legal developments that have happened in this field. And to speak about this very vast area with all of its developments and changes, we have someone that's very well suited and is also a new face onto the program. I'm very pleased to invite onto the show Mr. Suresh Perera, attorney at law. Thank you very much, sir, for coming to the studio today to explain all the changes that have been going on in the legal landscape when it comes to taxation law. A little bit of an introduction into how we are going to be approaching this topic. First, we'll be talking about the fundamentals and the basics with the current context as well, with where the legislature has changed essentially and what exactly the general public need to look out for when it comes to changes in taxation law. Next, we'll be talking about the contemporary issues as well as the structural changes that we can expect to see moving forward. And finally, we'll be touching a little bit about the future of taxation law and the current economic status of the country moving forward.
Hello, my name is Yahali and I'm a management student. My question is on the current context. What are the major changes that have been done to tax law at present?
All right, well, without any further ado, let's get right into the discussion. Once again, thank you very much, sir. We have a lot to break down and discuss, specifically with knowing the fact that most of the changes that we have seen with this current government coming in as well legally has happened in the tax field. So I'd like to start us off. Of course, we've already discussed the fundamentals of taxation legislation in the country, but I want to ask you about the current context. Can you please walk us through an overview of all the major tax reforms that Sri Lanka has seen take place with the past 2 years, and also specifically relating to, I believe this is the most important and relevant, the payee taxes, and also the registration of individuals that have to pay taxes as well with the tax identification number. Can you walk us through these changes, sir?
Yeah, actually there have been much changes with regard to the personal income taxation as well as the other areas of taxation also. So I'll start with the payee taxes. As we recall, basically in 2019 there was a sweeping tax reliefs that were given to the individuals, and that resulted in the employer refraining from deduction of the taxes at source. That means the payee taxes was abolished. And on self-assessment basis, individuals invited to pay, but then there was a small change thereafter. It was made a choice. In case the employees requested, the employer was to deduct, so there was a choice. And somewhere into 2023, that was made mandatory. In other words, payee taxes was introduced under a different name called Advanced Personal Income Tax, or what we call APIT. And from 2023, employers had to deduct taxes at source mandatorily. Right? So that's the change we have seen. And of course, there were changes with regard to the quantum of the taxes to be deducted, the tax rates, etc. change. So what do we have now? Right now, basically, we have in relation to the employees or in relation to the individuals, there is 1.8 million that is tax-free. That we call as the tax-free threshold. And the first 1 million is liable for tax at the rate of 6%. And the next 5 lakhs is liable at the rate of 18%. Like in 5 lakh slabs, we can see tax rates moving from 6, 18, 24, 30 and 36%. Right? So the highest tax rate applicable in Sri Lanka today is 36%. So a person who has for a month 358,000 rupees, let's say monthly income 358,000, reaches the highest tax bracket of 36%. In other words, for an year, if a person receives more than, moment you hit 4.3 million for annual income for a year, the person is liable for tax at the rate of 36%. So that is what the situation with regard to the quantum of the taxes. Well, with regard to, you also talked about the registrations. Yes, now as of now, the current law is anyone who is above 18 years must obtain a TIN registration, taxpayer identification number. That does not mean that the person has to pay taxes. It's only that you have to get a TIN registration number. But if you have income more than 1.2 million for a year, then you are liable for income tax. So that requires the person to obtain, in addition to TIN registration, another registration that's called the registration for income tax, and start paying income taxes. So that is where I think what the knowledge that is required for the normal public. And there's something interesting. There was at once upon a time, let's say from 2020 to 2022, there was this specific deduction that was actually very helpful for the general public. There was a tax deduction in relation to the education expenses, health expenses, housing loan interest, and contribution to the pension schemes. And of course, there was a ridiculous tax relief that was granted. Basically, the money that was spent on purchasing shares or instruments that are listed in the Colombo Stock Exchange were also given a tax deduction. So there was a five types of expenses that were given as tax deduction in addition to the normal general expenses, and this was taken out. So that's
these are the major changes that we have seen as well.
Okay, there's more than that also, I would say. And then
let's look at it, sir. Yes.
Yeah, let's look at the foreign currency income. Now the latest change is starting from 1st of April 2025. Earlier, foreign currency earnings were exempt from income tax, provided it fulfilled the certain criteria. But now there's a 15%, up to 15% of minimum tax that can come with regard to the foreign currency earnings, right? And of course, then let's talk about the withholding taxes. That is also very important. And earlier, say a person receiving interest from a bank was subject to 5% withholding tax at source. That means the bank deducted 5% withholding taxes. And now, starting from April, that 5% went up to 10%. So that led to a controversy. But of course, it's not an increase of the tax liability as such. It's basically at the deduction of the taxes by the bank, the quantum went up from 5% to 10%, right? So it does not have impact on the tax liability per se. And then, let's say with regard to the dividends, earlier dividends were subject to 14% withholding tax. A company paying dividends had to deduct 14%. But the person who is receiving, an individual shareholder who is receiving that dividend had to pay up to 36%. So there was a change there. So now what's the change? That 14% was increased to 15%, but the amount withholding taxes that were deducted by the company at 15% was made a final withholding tax. In other words, the individual shareholder need not pay taxes beyond that 15% that is deducted at source. So it's an advantage to the individual shareholders who receive dividends. And of course, capital gains tax continue to be 10% for individuals right now. In the last budget, November, there was a proposal to increase from 10% to 15%, but still laws have not been enacted for that. So that's in a nutshell. That is what we can see with regard to the taxes, income tax affecting the individuals. Overall, as we all know, in Sri Lanka, there is a population of 22 million. So according to the statistics, approximately, now the law is basically if a person is above 18 years must obtain a TIN, notwithstanding whether you are 95 years or whether, yes. Right? So depending on this. So that means basically, as per the numbers, out of the 22 million, 14 million is above 18 years. But only around 6.2 million have registered for income tax. Out of that, registered for TIN. So out of that 6.2 million, also only 1.1 million has obtained a registration for income tax. So that is the productive population that will be paying taxes. Now, when I say productive population, it means the tax-paying, income tax-paying population. So, though we have obtained registration, let's say another 5 million has registered or other up for TIN, they are not liable for tax because they are below the threshold of 1.8 million. So that's the overall basically with regard to the personal income taxes.
Exactly. I think that's a perfectly good overview and a good segue into the rest of the contemporary discussion we have to get as well. All of those updates have occurred very drastically over the past few years, and specifically the accountability aspect as well. As you mentioned, of the 22 million population, only about 6 million are actual registered taxpayers, and that might be a reflection.
6 million is only registered for teen, but out of that only 1.5 million is contributing to the
actual taxes. Yes. So that actually raises another question of curiosity, which is the balance of taxes. Now you mentioned, of course, that's specifically direct and indirect taxes is what I want to focus on in this question. Can you tell us, now you listed quite a few of the taxes that have changed in quantum or the activation or deactivation of it. Can you tell us how balanced it is right now in the taxation climate? Yeah. Is direct and indirect taxes properly balanced, or is
correct? So this is the problem that is affecting our tax system. Our tax system is not equitable. I think we have been discussing about this. When you look at the direct to indirect tax ratio, direct taxes contribute only 20% of the total tax collection, whereas in case of 80% comes from the direct taxes. So when there are indirect taxes, those taxes are regressive. So it actually affects the low income earners more than the high income earners. That is the concept of the regressiveness, right? So we have been trying to reduce this ratio, but nothing has happened. It continues to be the same ratio that we see. Now, recently there was a report by the World Bank, where the World Bank has pointed out, due to the VAT in Sri Lanka, the VAT rate is 18%. It's very high. It used to be 15%. 15% was increased to 18% a few years back. Right? So now that's again, we as a country we do have a bad economic situation. So the government has to collect taxes, but you have to collect taxes in equitable manner from the broader shoulders that can afford to pay the taxes, and not from the relatively low from the low income earning categories. So now what is happening is, when you have this high indirect tax collection, that means it's not a fair way of collection of the taxes. So this is what the World Bank has pointed out, and it has pointed out that during the last year, 5% of the disposable income of the poorest category of the country has reduced. The disposable income has come down by 5%. Why? Because of this high VAT rate that we have in Sri Lanka, and also cutting the subsidies like the electricity, etc. So that has contributed to drop of 5% of the disposable income of the poorest section of the thing. So these are things that we have to relook at when you're making the tax policies.
Exactly. We have to consider how drastically indirect taxes can affect in the entirety of the population, as opposed to direct taxes and the certain earning groups as well, that we can see that, as you mentioned in the previous question, with who is eligible for what kind of tax as well. I want to, before we go in for a break, actually get a little bit of an opinion from you as well. Yes, of course, sir.
Yeah, so now basically, when you look at the indirect taxes, we do have a threshold of 60 million for VAT, and the same threshold is applicable for social security contribution levy as well. So it is 60 million. Once upon a time, it used to be 12 million in 2019, and then it was suddenly increased to 300 million. So what is that 60 million now? Again, you have to keep in mind, if we reduce it again, that may have an impact again with regard to the contribution from the VAT will go up. Social security contribution will go up. Then we are again looking at that ratio 2080. We are going to collect it from the regressive taxes.
So we're barely keeping a head above water as well when it comes to that aspect. So there's this question that arises specifically. I understand that this is going a little bit away from the focus of this program, which is to educate the audience relating to the legal updates that have occurred in the taxation environment in Sri Lanka. But can we see any sort of communication as to what the current government's policy objectives would be behind the changing of the tax structure that we have, and the implementation of these new means as well? specifically the changes that they have done very recently to taxation. Also, when it comes to a legal standpoint, we understand that there is a sense of equity that we have to maintain, specifically for the most vulnerable of our population as well. What are your thoughts on this? How exactly can we navigate this scenario?
Correct. So actually tax policy making in this economic environment is a challenging thing for any government. But having said that thing, we have to see, okay, are we making right policies where you safeguard the vulnerable segment of the society and try to collect taxes from the correct segment of the society. So that's the important one. And so when you are looking at this, okay, what is the objective of tax policy making now under the current government? They do have the challenge of following the IMF targets. IMF has given very stiff targets with regard to the changing the tax to GDP ratio of Sri Lanka, which is very low. I think somewhere in 2020 it used to be around 8.1% tax to GDP ratio, whereas by 2026 we have to achieve 14%. So main policy objective will be to achieve
to bridge that gap.
To bridge that gap, to basically achieve the IMF target. So how do we do that thing? Broaden the tax base, and then also you will have to look at other things, basically how they broadening the tax base, and then look at the tax rates,
the balancing of the direct and indirect.
Yes, direct and indirect taxes kind of things.
Exactly. I want to get into the structural changes and the legal changes when it comes to VAT as well that we have seen over the past few months, and the pay system. I want to get a little bit more information into the workings of it as well on a legal standpoint. But before we get into any such specifics, let's take a very short commercial break. You're watching Law, Land and Liberty. We'll be right back after this. Stay tuned.
My name is Chanuki Tenekon and I'm a law student. So my question is on contemporary issues. What are the biggest hindrances to tax legislature in Sri Lanka?
Welcome back to Law, Land and Liberty. We're in conversation with Mr. Suresh Perera, attorney at law. Thank you very much, sir, for the previous discussion. I believe we got a very good fundamental understanding into the recent changes that we have seen and the developments we have seen when it comes to the legal landscape of taxation, specifically for the man on the ground, and also in a broader aspect of how and where these drastic changes have occurred. Now, one of the biggest issues that we have seen was the progressive income tax discussion. We touched it a little bit previously as well, but I want to get into it a little bit deeper, specifically when it comes to professionals and businesses, SMEs as well. When it comes to the bedrock of our economy, these individuals and these businesses and professionals are the ones that are carrying it. How has the progressive income tax really affected when it comes to the changes that they have made? What are the biggest the issues that we see when it comes to that specific segment of businesses and professionals?
Okay, two different things. So when you say professionals, yes, basically they are individuals. So individual income tax structure in Sri Lanka is progressive. We have the progressive tax system. But when it comes to companies, it's a flat tax system. We have a specific tax rate that a company should follow. So right. So now this issue of the professionals is very interesting. In Sri Lanka, what happened in 2019 was the taxes at source were reduced, or rather basically eliminated. So that, and basically that's in all individuals, not just the professionals, had to pay taxes on self-assessment basis, subject to that APIT change that I explained earlier, right? So now what happened was when that system changed, where it was made mandatory. For instance, let's see the returns received by the individuals, say the bank interest. Earlier only 5% withholding tax, now it went up to 10%. So now that kind of changes gave the feeling, okay, now we have to pay higher taxes because of these changes. But the answer is, it's not a case of a change of the tax liability. It basically strengthening the tax administration. So that basically were felt by the different categories in different ways. So it's not a case of tax liability going up. As I said, it's a case of strengthening the tax administration resulted in the repercussions coming on the tax compliance that we witnessed. Right?
So does that mean that with the introduction of the new changes and the inclusion of more sectors, and also, there's an entire initiative and a drive now to get registrations to occur, and
Correct, yes.
and there's a lot of I guess accountability that has been placed on the shoulders of everyday Sri Lankans as well in order to ensure that they are registered with the system. Does that mean that this kind of initiative and this kind of effort would, in the long run, end up having some sort of negative repercussion when it comes to the enthusiasm to actually pay your dues? Or do you think, as a professional that has been in this industry, what kind of reaction can we expect from the masses to these kind of changes?
Okay, so when you say professionals, now once upon a time in Sri Lanka, for professionals there was a different tax bracket. There was a lower tax rate that was there long time back. So now basically there is no such thing like that. All individuals are treated equally. So they have to pay taxes according to the same progressive tax slabs and the tax rates. So everyone has to follow the tax slab that I explained, and the maximum tax liability tax rate is 36% for professionals as well as lay persons. So it's the same uniform system that we have. So the question is, now we do hear that the professionals are migrating. There's a brain drain taking place. So is it really because of the taxes, or is it because of combination of other factors also? So that's something that we have to analyze first. But if it is taxes, can we stop that brain drain by reducing the taxes applicable to identified professionals? That means the professional categories. Is that answer? It's something policymakers have to analyze and see.
Exactly. It's a bit of a reflective question as well, considering that the legal developments already have taken place, and we have to make do with the environment that we have been given now, specifically with the lawmakers as well. I want to move.
Can I add?
Yes, of course.
Okay. So basically, the question that we have to analyze here is, can a particular category of individuals, professionals or taxpayers go to courts and seek redress to reduce their taxes? The answer to that is, according to our legal framework, that's not possible, because courts have always taken up the position that when it comes to matters of economic policy making, that is up to the government. The courts will not get involved with regard to the tax policies, unless tax policies are unreasonable, where they violate, say, the legal provisions. So in that environment, there is no room for a particular category of, say, the professionals or taxpayers to approach the court and petition that our taxes are too high. Please rule that the tax rate should be brought down in our case. So for that kind of approach to the court will not be successful, because there is a series of case law in Sri Lanka as well as in other countries with regard to this aspect. Economic policy making, tax policy making is the domain of the government, and the courts do not get involved. Courts will get involved only with regard to the interpretation of the tax laws.
Exactly. I actually want to ask you a question of curiosity as well, relating to the role that the courts play when it comes to the tax laws that have already been implemented in the country. As you mentioned, now we cannot seek concessionary rates through judgments and rulings, because of course the courts have already, through previous case law as well, we have seen that domain belongs to the government, and therefore there is no interfering apart from, unless there are dire cases like a breach on fundamental rights or something
Correct,
related
exactly.
to those grounds. What exactly is the role of the court when it comes to the interpretation of tax law? Can you please walk us through what the legal system actually has when it comes to the maintaining of tax law?
So interesting. So it's like this. In Sri Lanka, according to the constitution, as we know, basically we have the three arms of the government: the parliament that makes the laws, it's the parliament that makes the tax laws as well, and the executive arm of the government execute those laws, implement those laws. So when if there's an injustice with regard to the manner of implementation of the enacted laws by the parliament, the legislature, then the court's role is to interpret them. So that happens under the appellate procedure. So any person who is aggrieved by a executive action, let's say the Inland Revenue Officer's action, the way they are interpreting the law, then they can go under the tax appellate procedure, first appeal to the, of course, to the Commissioner General himself, and then to the Tax Appeals Commission, and to the Court of Appeal and Supreme Court with regard to a question of law, to interpret the law, but not with regard to the policy. That's where the difference is.
So there is a stark difference. There's a line that has been drawn and that has been implemented, and we've seen it in previous case law as well.
Correct, exactly.
So then, of course, that's a very clear demarcation. Specifically now, when it comes to the changes of thresholds and VAT as well, indirect taxes, value-added tax, can you walk us through the balance that we might see being struck when it comes to the implementation and changes of the rates of VAT?
Okay.
And how actually it has drawn serious criticism as well in recent times. But instead of getting into the political aspects of it, can you walk us through what we can expect to see as changes moving forward as well?
Correct. So actually this saga with regard to the VAT rate in Sri Lanka is, I think it's something that we should write a novel on, because we can see during the last, from the time of inception of the VAT, we can see Sri Lankan VAT rate changing many a times. So more than 10, 15, less than 15, but more, around 10 times kind of. Whereas when you compare this with the other countries, look at Australia, look at New Zealand, where they also have the same concept of the taxation of the value addition, it's less than 2, or New Zealand, I think it changed only twice, and Australia, the 10% GST rate has never changed. But Sri Lanka, we keep changing the rate. So the philosophy here is, once VAT rate is imposed, it should not be changed. Because the moment you change the VAT rate up or down, that gives the opportunity for the traders to make profiteering, blaming the government. So what is profiteering? Profiteering means basically, say the VAT rate changes by 1%, they increase their prices by 5% and then make a profit from the consumers. So this is one reason why once VAT rate is determined, it should not be changed frequently. But I think our policymakers do not understand that situation. Now the point here is, right now we are 18%, so what should we do? It's a very high rate. Can we bring it down now at this juncture? To me, the answer right now is, because we are in IMF program, bringing it down from 18 this year to, let's say, the 14 next year, it's not possible. That to me, basically, because that can result in again our tax revenue going down, and that can have severe repercussions with regard to the economy of the country. But in the long run, that should happen. But when you're trying to do that also, maybe in another couple of years' time, we need to ensure in our VAT law, we should have the specific clause called anti-profiteering clause, which means when you bring down the VAT rate from 18% to, let's say, 14%, that benefit should be passed on by the traders to the consumers. Any trader who does not do that thing should be taken to task, and that is where basically in countries like India, you find anti-profiteering authority has been established. So general public can go and complain to them that, say, the rate has come down by this number of percentage, they have reduced marginally, and they are not passing on that full benefit to the consumers. So that kind of a legal framework we need to have in Sri Lanka, taking into consideration the number of times that we have witnessed the changes of the VAT rate.
Exactly. That's actually I want to, towards the latter end of our discussion, I want to get into the potential reforms that we can see when it comes to, and also the introduction of maybe new concepts of legislature that could help to maybe stabilize the taxation environment in Sri Lanka. But this is a very important question. Can you tell us, sir, with your experience and your understanding, specifically when it comes to the compliance obligations for taxpayers, how exactly have the recent amendments to the Inland Revenue Act really shaped the compliance obligation? Now, we did speak about it previously as well. When it comes to the compliance, what implementations have been done, like a nationalized registration system that has been in place. But can you tell us about the compliance aspect, because that has seen the most change, I believe, when it comes
Correct,
to,
yes.
because we've already had the legislature, we just haven't had the obligation being met. Can you talk about that, sir?
Yes, so basically to achieve this, to increase the tax collection, I think during the past 1 year we have witnessed many changes that have been introduced to the tax administration. Tax administration has been strengthened, and I think we have seen productive results coming from that also, because right now if you look at the tax collections, the collection targets seems to be, they seem to be meeting the collection targets, not only meeting, going beyond the collection targets also. So that is the result of the changes that we have witnessed to the tax administration, including broadening the tax base by making it mandatory for the people to register. So it's a debatable question with regard to whether everyone above 18 years should be called upon to get a TIN number. But overall, basically, we see there is a big change with regard to the tax collection of the countries, not only in relation to the income tax from the individuals, in other areas of taxation also.
Exactly. Now, I think we have come to time on this segment. I want to ask you about the implementation aspect as well. Now, we just spoke about the initiatives that have been taking place in order to ensure better compliance from taxpayers. But I want to talk about the legal concerns that we can see popping up down the line as well, and what we can expect to see when it comes to an international context, if there are lessons that we can learn and reflect on to our legislature as well. But before we get into any of such specifics, let's take a short commercial break once again. You're watching Law, Land and Liberty. We'll be right back with the final segment.
I'm Surya and I'm an HR officer. My question is on the future. How can we expect tax laws to develop in the following years?
Welcome back to Law, Land and Liberty. We're in our final segment in conversation with Mr. Suresh Perera, attorney at law. And we just got done speaking about the first two segments of our discussion on tax law and its changes and updates. Thank you very much once again, sir. This is unfortunately our final segment, and I believe we covered as much ground as we could with the limited time that we had. Now I believe it's one of the more essential areas of this discussion, specifically relating to looking forward into the future as well. When it comes to Sri Lanka's current taxation legislation, we've seen a lot of changes taking place, and hopefully it is in a positive direction as well when it comes to stabilizing our taxpayer base as well. Can you please tell us if there's lessons that we can learn, as previously we asked before the break as well, if there's key pieces of legislation that we can lift from other nations, or are there concepts that we can implement when it comes to our legal system, specifically to help facilitate a better tax environment in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, very good question. So if you look at the Sri Lankan tax system overall, I would say it is it's a reasonable system. We do have a tax legislation, we do have a appellate procedure, and of course we do have an enforcement system, mechanisms, etc. But when you look at the current environment, because of the heavy pressure that is there on the IRD officers to reach the targets, you can see sometimes they may deviate from the correct path also. That can hamper, that can have repercussions on the rights of the taxpayers. Now, I'm not talking about the legal aspect of here. This is basically due to the maladministration, there can be many taxpayers suffering grievances. Now, what is the forum that we have in Sri Lanka for these taxpayers who are aggrieved by the actions of the IRD officers to go and complain? Is it the Court of Appeal? No, they can't afford to do that thing because that's very costly. Legal fees are very high in Sri Lanka. So this is where basically we need to have this concept of the legal ombudsman, tax ombudsman. So if there is a tax ombudsman, that will strengthen the taxpayers' faith with regard to the tax system in Sri Lanka. That is also part of the equity of the tax system in Sri Lanka. So if a taxpayer is facing difficulties at the tax collection with the tax collection authorities, where they can go and explain their grievances and obtain justice, and that's the office of the tax ombudsman that we need to introduce in Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, this concept was mentioned twice in two budget proposals, not implemented. So I know basically it needs only a piece of legislation to be enacted, and that can be done. So my first point is introduce the tax ombudsman in Sri Lanka, and that is going to actually helpful for the government because that will increase the taxpayer confidence in the tax system. That's one. The number two is tax is a complicated system. One change with regard to one tax can have repercussions with regard to the other taxes. So before making tax policies, either to grant tax reductions, either to give tax exemptions, scrap the tax exemptions or increase the rates, etc., these tax policy decisions should be very carefully analyzed. Cost-benefit analysis of each of these must be computed, and then you have to take the final decision. This should not be, tax policy making should not be due to ad hoc, arbitrary actions or the thought processes. So in Sri Lanka, we should have a tax policy unit. This is something, this is not my recommendation, this is what we find even in the IMF literature. We should have a tax policy unit at the finance ministry reporting to the finance minister, where this, there should be a few officers carrying out this tax cost benefit analysis and looking at the implementation of the tax laws, looking at the merits and the demerits of the certain tax policies that we have, etc., and educating the finance minister so that he can take corrective action. So establishment of the tax policy unit is the number 2 point that I want to point out.
Exactly. So a tax ombudsman and also a unit for the policy, and also maybe to help regulate as well. Well, not regulate, but rather, you know, maybe a watchdog, maybe something that can help monitor the changes in policy and if it's reflecting positively towards the economy and also the people as well. We don't have much time, sir, but which is unfortunate. But in the short time that we do have, I wanted to ask you specifically relating to the standard of taxation law in Sri Lanka. Do you believe that we are at somewhat of a respectable level when it comes to international standards? You mentioned GST tax has not changed in Australia ever, and of course, you know, New Zealand has seen very little change. So compared to that and our current understanding of taxation law, which, you know, we might wake up the next day and see a new gazette that's published and a lot of conversation can happen. Do you believe that Sri Lanka's taxation legislature, the fundamental pieces of legislation that we have that governs taxation law, is it stable? Or do we have a lot more work to do when it comes to meeting international standards?
Okay, let me put it this way. We do have a fairly stable tax legislation in Sri Lanka. Sometimes this legislation could have been drafted better to eliminate any ambiguities that are there. But at the same time, I do feel there is much room for improvement and aligning Sri Lankan tax system with the good tax systems in the other countries. For instance, basically this concept of imposing digital VAT. Non-resident service providers providing services to the Sri Lankan consumers and deriving income in Sri Lanka as to how to tax this. Recently we saw regulation being implemented, but regulation being introduced, now it's getting deferred, and even areas like, say, taxation of cryptocurrency, another area. Now we do have to, when you look at the other countries, they do have legislation for all these areas. So it is important that Sri Lanka should go to that standards. In order to go for those standards, first the knowledge base should be there with regard to the changes that are occurring in the globally with regard to this tax policy. Now for that, there has to be a unit studying these areas. Tax is a complicated system. Local tax is complicated. When it comes to international tax, it's much complicated. So and tax is not something that you can learn within one day or so. So basically you have to keep studying. So for that, again, I come back to my main point. Sri Lankan Finance Ministry requires a tax policy unit so that they study and give the proper advice to the Finance Minister.
Exactly. And as a final remark, sir, for individuals that might be watching to understand the changes that have taken place in our taxation legislature and the tax environment as well, is there a message you'd like to leave specifically relating to, well, of course, the accountability aspect and the obligations that we have as each and every one of us as a citizen of this country can be considered as a taxpayer once we reach the age of 18 and we meet the specific requirements and qualifications to be a taxpayer? Is there any sort of message you'd like to leave with them specifically relating to understanding the laws that govern taxation because of how much constant flux that we have seen in our law in itself?
Yes, now it's a very interesting point. So actually, if you look at the awareness of tax laws in Sri Lanka among the general public, it's very low. Inland Department is doing a substantial work with regard to making awareness with regard to tax law, but still, because of the complicated nature of the tax statutes, still I find the general, even the professionals, the knowledge with regard to the fundamental tax aspects are very low. So spend some time, learn the tax system and appreciate why the taxes should be paid. It's your obligation, and let's make Sri Lanka a better place.
Exactly. I think it at the end of the day, the buck stops with us specifically, since we are all citizens of this country. We need to understand that we also have a role of accountability to pay proportionately our taxes as well. And it starts with understanding the legislature that governs the taxes that we pay. So thank you very much once again for coming on to the program. So I believe despite the short time that we had to explain the vast changes and developments, I feel like we got quite a bit of good insight into the current context. So thank you once again, sir, for coming to the studio today.
Thank you.
All right, well, we leave you tonight with the words of Frederick the Great. No government can exist without taxation. This money must necessarily be levied on the people, and the grand art consists of levying so as not to oppress. That's all we have for you tonight on Law, Land and Liberty. If you had missed any of today's programs, you can always rewatch by catching us on our YouTube page, youtube.com/otherderana-english. And please do share your thoughts and feedback with us through email at feedback.ad24english@derana.lk or via WhatsApp at 076 805 7933. Thank you very much for watching. Have a great night.